Ukraine needs security guarantees. That's the message that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has delivered time and time again when asked about the possibility of peace with Russia. Zelensky's logic is simple. Without security guarantees, Russia is free to attack again, regardless of what Vladimir Putin says about peace. Ukraine had hoped that the US would be part of those security guarantees, but Trump says no troops. The US won't send soldiers in on the ground, but the UK, France, and a so-called coalition of the willing are gearing up to defend Ukraine. On August 20th, and the day after his White House meeting with Zelenskyy, US President Donald Trump told journalists that there is no chance that the US will send any of its troops into Ukraine as part of a security guarantee. When it comes to security, Trump told Fox News after the meeting, Europeans are willing to put people on the ground. We're willing to help them with things, especially, probably, by air. There are a couple of little snippets to which you should pay attention. Europeans on the ground and US air support. We'll come back to both soon. Before that, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirmed Trump's comments in a follow-up statement. She said Trump has definitively stated US boots will not be on the ground in Ukraine, but we can certainly help in the coordination and perhaps provide other means of security guarantees to our European allies. So the headline here is that no US troops will enter Ukraine under any circumstances. However, no boots on the ground doesn't mean no support at all. Beyond allusions to Europe helping out in Ukraine, the White House is making claims that it will provide some kind of air support. What that means isn't entirely clear. It's possible that the US will help Ukraine to purchase more air defense systems to serve as protection against Russia's drones and missiles. It'd be a surprise. Back in July, Trump announced that he'd made a deal with NATO to ensure more US-made air defense systems, such as Patriot missile launchers, would find their way into Ukraine. It stands to reason that an air-based security guarantee would build on this, perhaps with even more Patriot launchers. But it would also be disappointing to Ukraine, an example of the US just doing what it's already doing, only potentially ramped up. Another possibility Sky News suggests is that the US might use some of its fighter jets to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. If that happens, it would likely involve other NATO members in a joint effort to keep Ukraine's skies safe, much like the NATO air policing mission that currently protects the skies of NATO member nations. That mission offers rapid responses to any potential enemy incursions into an ally's airspace, meaning this option would at least give Ukraine some form of aerial protection that is already being used by NATO. Then there's the third option, the option that Putin absolutely doesn't want to hear about. Trump might be hinting that the US will conduct airstrikes on Russia if it attacks Ukraine while the country is protected via security guarantees. That would be a major step and could spark outright war between Russia and the US. However, Putin would fear that third option because he knows that the US knows that Russia's air defenses can't stand up to the might of a dedicated US airstrike. You only need to look at what happened to Iran when the US sent its air force to attack the country's nuclear weapons facilities during Operation Midnight Hammer. America's success in the mission will worry Putin for the simple reason that many of Iran's air defenses, the very weapons that were supposed to stop America's missiles, failed. Many of those air defense systems were made in Russia. As Defense Blog noted when Operation Midnight Hammer happened in June, according to Russian-language military forums and unofficial commentary shared across pro-Kremlin channels, the Israeli operation has amplified existing doubts about Russia's capacity to withstand a coordinated assault from a technologically advanced adversary such as NATO. The National Security Journal also asked the question of what happened to the Russian-made S-400s that Iran had received to defend against that sort of airstrike the US conducted back in June. Iran had taken delivery of those systems, which are among the most modern that Russia has developed, but they were conspicuously absent during Operation Midnight Hammer. Had Iran not set them up yet? Or were the S-400s helpless against US B-2 Spirit stealth bombers? The latter situation seems more plausible than Iran spending good money on air defense systems that it doesn't immediately set up, which is what will have Putin sweating. If Trump's mention of providing Ukraine with some sort of air support within a security guarantee framework includes aerial retaliation for Russia's attacks, Iran showed Putin that there's not a whole lot Russia can do to defend itself. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. All we know for sure is that the White House is making vague assurances of air support without talking about what that support looks like. The other certainty is that the US won't be putting boots on the ground as part of any sort of plan to create a defensive force inside Ukraine to guard against future Russian attacks if a peace deal is struck. So if not the US, then who? Trump already revealed the answer with his mention of Europeans that we shared earlier in the video. On the eve of Trump's White House meeting with Zelenskyy, an interesting statement appeared on the official UK government website, dubbed a Statement of the Co-Chairs of the Coalition of the Willing. That statement appears to have been drafted by UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron, to showcase support for Ukraine regardless of what happened at the White House. One section of that statement stood out. After praising Trump for showing a willingness to offer security guarantees to Ukraine, the statement said that the members of the coalition of the willing were willing to go in. They re-emphasized the readiness to deploy a reassurance force once hostilities have ceased, and to help secure Ukraine's skies and seas and regenerate Ukraine's armed forces, the statement read. The takeaway here is that the UK and France are leading a collective of European nations that will serve as the ground-based security guarantee that the US refuses to offer. Of course, that brings us to the obvious question: what is the coalition of the willing? The Independent goes into detail about the group in an August 19th report. It notes that though the UK and France are serving as the joint leaders of the group, the coalition is far larger than those two already impressive military nations. It's actually a group of over 30 countries, making it almost as large as NATO in terms of the number of member nations, that have all committed to doing whatever it takes to ensure Ukraine has proper security guarantees in place once the war ends. Beyond France and the UK, those countries are as follows: Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Germany, Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Turkey, and Ukraine itself. That's below 30, as any mathematician will tell you. However, Canada, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand have all expressed their support for the coalition, though it's unclear if any of those 4 countries would be willing to send their troops into Ukraine. Both the European Union and NATO are also part of the coalition as collective organizations, though they appear to be non-force members. That makes sense. There are members of both groups that may not feel comfortable with sending soldiers into Ukraine, so it's up to each coalition country to decide whether it wants to join in a force participant role. This coalition hasn't sprung up as a reaction to Trump's comments about not sending US soldiers into Ukraine. It's existed for much of the war, with Royal United Service Institute member Edward Arnold telling The Independent that it's played a key role in Ukraine's defense. The coalition of the willing has been successful in advocating for Ukraine and communicating with Trump and the US administration during its outreach to Russia, Arnold says. Moreover, it's undertaken lengthy military planning and has established a leadership and command structure. Sending soldiers into Ukraine is a big step up from this type of work. But if Starmer and Macron are to be believed, it's a step that the coalition is willing to take. Though Trump has outright said no to any hint of US soldiers serving as part of a ground force alongside the coalition of the willing, what we have here appears to be somewhat cooperative. The coalition takes care of things on the ground, with the US helping out with air support, perhaps. Regardless, Zelenskyy seems to have come away from his meeting with Trump feeling fairly optimistic. Yesterday, important talks took place in Washington with the Presidents of the United States and European leaders, Zelenskyy said in a statement on X. This was a truly significant step toward ending the war and ensuring the security of Ukraine and our people. We are already working on the concrete content of the security guarantees. Today, we continue coordination at the level of leaders. There will be discussions and we are preparing the relevant information. Ukraine's president added his thanks to all of his country's partners for their support, suggesting even further that something is in the works in terms of a Ukrainian security guarantee. But here's the thing, nobody really knows what that guarantee looks like yet. However, there are some ideas. In its report on Trump's comments and the possibility of the coalition of the willing entering Ukraine, Euromaidan Press says that the likely plan will be conducted in 2 phases. First, European forces as part of the coalition would be stationed in Ukraine, though away from active combat zones. They would focus on training Ukraine's troops while providing backup if Putin crosses the line and assaults those coalition forces. The second phase would involve the US, which will provide intelligence, weapons, and possibly air defense systems, all of which it's already doing. Border surveillance, perhaps carried out by US aircraft, would also be provided. The US would also serve as a facilitator to keep military hardware flowing into Ukraine, even if it's working with European partners to do so rather than providing weapons directly. That would seem like a solid enough plan. However, it seems to assume that the coalition of the willing will be entering Ukraine when the country is still actively at war, at least if the mention of keeping European troops away from combat zones is anything to go by. That's something that Putin may not allow, with any European forces that enter the country likely only able to do so when a peace agreement has been signed. We'll come back to Putin's thoughts on all of this in a moment. For now, the BBC's security correspondent Frank Gardner offers some suggestions about what security guarantees could look like for Ukraine. In an August 19th article, he also highlights that policing Ukraine's airspace could be a possibility, though it says US participation would likely have to be bolstered by Ukrainian neighbors like Poland and Romania. There would also need to be clear rules of engagement drawn up, which Euromaidan Press doesn't mention. In other words, what happens if those air police encounter a Russian threat? Do they shoot on sight? Escort the threat out of Ukrainian airspace? These are questions that haven't been answered, and they have the potential to act as stumbling blocks in any negotiations related to delivering security guarantees to Ukraine. Other options could include sending European Navy ships into the Black Sea, likely to serve as a deterrent to Russia's Black Sea fleet, in addition to being a force that ensures Ukraine can still use the waterway as a trade route. Turkey would have to agree to that. It controls the key straits that lead into the Black Sea, and it hasn't been letting any military ships in or out since the war started, with some exceptions like return to home port at the very beginning of the war. As a member of the Coalition of the Willing, Turkey may lift these restrictions, at least for the coalition, as part of the security guarantees being provided. As for troops on the ground, that's a possibility. There's a problem. The Coalition of the Willing cannot possibly muster enough troops to deploy to safeguard that line of contact, even if Russian President Vladimir Putin would agree to that, which he won't, Gardner writes. Or more accurately, the coalition could provide enough troops, however they'd have to weaken their domestic forces substantially to do so. The line of contact Gardner mentions is likely the Ukraine war's front line, which the BBC estimated to be about 745 miles long back in July. That's a lot of ground to cover, and any ground deployment would have to be stationed directly behind that front line to serve as a buffer if it's to prevent Russian forces from attacking again. Still, ideas are being tossed around, but now we come back to Putin. What does he think about all of this? In the past, Putin has flatly refused the very concept of Europe sending any soldiers into Ukraine, even to serve as a peacekeeping force or a buffer to prevent any further fighting. Russia's leader reaffirmed that opposition in February, despite Trump claiming that Putin was open to the idea at the time. Putin's Kremlin mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov said, "There is a position on this matter that was expressed by the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. I have nothing to add to this and nothing to comment on. I leave this without comment." No position translates to a flat no in Peskov speak. However, Putin's position on European soldiers entering the ground appears to have softened in the months since. It's notable that Peskov's February comments came before serious discussions about a Ukraine war ceasefire took place. In its August 20th report on Ukraine's upcoming security guarantees, Euromaidan Press says that Putin agreed with Trump that Ukraine should receive reliable security guarantees during the meeting between the two world leaders in Alaska. The outlet says that these guarantees would be somewhat similar to NATO's Article 5 protections, which duty-bind all NATO allies to come to the direct aid of any other ally that is attacked on its own soil. On August 17th, the BBC also reported that Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff claimed that Putin had agreed that the US and Europe could effectively offer Article 5-like language to cover a security guarantee. So all signs point to Putin suddenly being okay with European boots on the ground and US aircraft in the skies over Ukraine after the war. However, any savvy observer will find themselves wondering why Putin has engaged in this sudden turnaround. The answer is there's a catch, as there always is with Putin. According to the Financial Times, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov laid out what Russia wants a security guarantee to look like. Russia will accept if the security guarantees to Ukraine are provided on equal basis with the participation of countries like China, the United States, the United Kingdom and France, Lavrov said in the wake of the Alaska meeting and Trump's White House face-to-face with Zelenskyy. This means that we were missing a key part of the story from the earlier claims that Putin is open to Ukraine having security guarantees. Russia wants to be involved in creating those guarantees, and it wants to involve a key ally, namely China, when doing it. Some might argue that this is fair enough for Russia. Ultimately, security guarantees are designed to prevent war from breaking out, and Russia could argue that its forces, or at least the forces of its allies, should have a presence in any buffer zone that gets created. After all, what if Ukraine attacks us? Russia could say. What guarantees does Russia have? Of course, it's obvious that Ukraine would have no desire to start another war with Russia. It didn't want any part of the war Ukraine and Russia are fighting right now, as it was forced into defending itself against an invasion that Putin started. And as the Financial Times says, one unnamed EU diplomat said, Russia's sudden insistence on involving China in any sort of security guarantee is a huge WTF moment. And to add to all of the confusion, the deputy head of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, took to X on August 20th to muddy the waters even more. The brainless Gallic rooster can't let go of the idea of sending troops to Ukraine, Medvedev said of President Macron on August 20th. It's been explicitly stated, no NATO troops as peacekeepers. Russia won't accept such a security guarantee. But the hoarse, pathetic bird continues to crow to prove it's king of the coop. So, which is it, Russia? Do you approve of Ukraine having security guarantees or not? This is classic obfuscation of the issue by Russia, and it's a practice in which the nation's politicians are very well practiced. A clear message never seems to come out of the Kremlin, which is how Putin likes it. What we can take from all of this is that his idea of a security guarantee for Ukraine seems to involve more Russian and Chinese forces serving as a buffer, and few, if any, European soldiers on the ground. That's no security guarantee. It's the creation of a springboard Russia can use for future slaughter. With all of these mixed messages out of Moscow, is it any wonder that some within Europe are skeptical about what the supposed security guarantees will end up looking like? Several European officials remain skeptical about whether any guarantees will actually deter Putin or lead to lasting peace. The plan assumes Russia wants to end the war. That assumption hasn't been tested, Euromaidan Press points out. Writing for The Independent, Keir Giles says that skepticism should extend to Zelenskyy. He points out that the fundamentals of what was agreed between Russia and the US aren't fully known, and there still seems to be no concrete idea of what security guarantees will look like for Ukraine. Giles also says that the mention of a NATO-like Article 5 agreement appeared to be off base. The fact that this would represent a stunning reversal of not just NATO, but also US policy, combined with Witkoff's track record of a poor grasp of the key issues and misunderstanding what he's been told by the Russian side, should have set alarm bells ringing, despite the excitable media reaction, he writes. It's also confusing. And that means that despite all of the media reports we've touched on in this video, there are still only two concrete conclusions we can draw. First, the US won't send troops into Ukraine, though it may offer air support as part of a security guarantee. Second, the coalition of the willing, led by the UK and France, is ready to put boots on the ground. Ukraine will only hope that it will learn more very shortly. Right now, there's a distinct possibility that the security guarantees it's being promised could end up disappearing like dust in the wind. As it waits to hear more, Ukraine is still taking the fight to Russia, and it's focusing on Russia's oil refineries. Ukraine has gutted Russia's energy backbone in 3 weeks, taking out 13.5% of its enemy's refining capacity in the process. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments in the Ukraine war. And thank you, as always, for watching.